India Bastian,
And I'm Aubrey Calvin, and this is Southern Queeries,
exploring all things LGBTQ in the South.
All right. So, India, last episode we talked to your friend Mila. It was amazing. And part of 2022, I'm trying to stop using amazing so much, but Mila really was and is. Now, who is Ale that we're talking to this episode?
Oh gosh. So Ale does have like a formal bio, but the background with Ale is we actually went to, I guess in the States we call it middle school together. She was the awkward new kid, and no one wanted to talk to her. But I went up to her and sat down with her at the sandwich benches because I didn't want to play Kiss the Boys game. I thought it was gross. And she didn't want to play either. And so we bonded over secretly being queer unknowingly.
And not knowing about it. Yes.
Yeah. And then we kept up our friendship for years. I mean, we did all of middle school together, and then we did a little bit of junior high together. We both did some form of homeschooling. If my memory serves me correctly, I think she left to finish out high school. And I reconnected with her, as one does, on social media to find out that not only had she become a professor of like romance studies and lesbian history, dreamy, but she also came out as gay. And I was really excited to learn that she was gay, and we reconnected. She came and visited me in Atlanta, and then her mom still lives in our hometown. She's also had a stint as a stand-up comic.
Wow.
She also is on a different podcast regularly called Hablemos, Escritorias, which means let's talk writers, and she talks about female Latin writers in order to give them more visibility, because we actually have a huge amount of female and or non-binary writers in Latin America, but they're rarely featured. So she is now just an amazing friend of mine. She's really good friends with my sister. I love keeping up with her. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, she actually goes and has lunch and breakfast with my mom on a regular basis. And honestly, Aubrey, we just had a fantastic conversation with her, and I cannot wait for all of us to join in on the debate and the ongoing conversation of the difference between Latinx and Latine. And you had asked me earlier what my thoughts were on it.
Well, yeah, because, I do like this whole safe space LGBTQ ally training with other people at my college. And the person who leads it does so much work, and he's a great ally. But when I first started doing these trainings, like 5, 6 years ago, when I was first even just coming out myself, we were using the term Latinx as a part of the training and saying we encourage people to use this in the classrooms, and we encourage instructors to use Latinx in the classroom when talking to students, because it's a more inclusive language, a term, because Latinos can be so gendered, and so much of the Spanish language is gendered. And Latinx was supposed to be the inclusive one. And now it seems like there's a lot of backlash or pushback, and a lot of people are saying this is what United States Americans are trying to do with Spanish culture, Latin culture, and that it's not what people want. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this, because I'm very inclusive in my classroom. It's become the point where all the LGBTQ students somehow find their way to me. I still struggle using Latinx in the classroom because I know it's controversial. What are your thoughts?
So I don't think using Latinx is wrong or bad. I do think, however, it is an Americanized proposition and attempt on being inclusive, which I have to give the American English Speaking Society props to. However, when it comes to Spanglish, English, and versus Spanish, when I first saw Latinx on a poster, it made me laugh because X in Spanish is silent.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say stuff like don't be X, which is the translation of the letter X,
Yes.
it actually means don't be indifferent, don't be boring, don't be X is um like non-existent, never mind, whatever. It's yeah, it's like whatever. So inadvertently, I don't think they did it on purpose, but people who wanted to be inclusive with Latinx actually backfired in the sense that it made it look like we don't care. One, two, you can't pronounce it in Spanish.
No,
So when I
you
look
cannot.
at Latinx, it just says Latin,
Yes.
which isn't particularly a word in Spanish. So I discovered a YouTube video of this 12-year-old girl talking to her mom about how the principal had suspended her because she was arguing with the teacher about creating a more inclusive language in Spanish and how things are gendered. And she used the word e in the end of the sentences where you would have a female or o male. So Latine is the Spanish equivalent of Latinx. I see how people can be super confused. It's really hard for me. I'm still practicing. It's like using they, them pronouns in English. Like in today's world, it's like smooth as butter. But in Spanish, doing Latine or using the E in Spanish, like ellas and nosotros, takes me a really long time. So it is a new up and coming process, I think, in our language.
It's very,
So I think both are awesome.
both are
That's my
awesome.
conclusion.
Well, I've used Latine or Latine a few times in class, and it's, I feel more comfortable with that. I have a hard time with Latinx. Um, I just want to call people what they want to be called. uh,
Yeah.
but I
So
also, I mean, this is what happens when you have a history like, French, and Corinne and I are learning French together. This is what happens when you have a language that is based on gender, where different nouns of objects are based on gender, things that you don't necessarily see in US English or British English. Like a chair is a chair. A chair is not masculine or feminine, but in some languages, a chair is a masculine or a feminine noun. And this is that conflict we're seeing.
yeah. So I'm excited for our listeners to hear what Ale has to say because I thought it was a really fruitful conversation.
I thought it was
And it's going to continue.
like we are not going to solve it, but I do like talking about it. So let's talk to Ale.
Well, so first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, so Alejandra is an assistant professor of Spanish with a focus on gender and sexuality in Latin America and the Caribbean at Michigan State University Department of Romance and Classical Studies, which I have to admit, I'm just like picturing that enormous title on the outside of your office door. Please tell me that's what it says.
I think it's been over a year since I was last in my office, but I feel like it just says my name, and it probably says assistant professor of Spanish. That's like the short version.
Boo! That's so nice.
That's it.
Yep.
What I loved about your intro is it also had a whole section on what your current book projects are. And the focus is on literary and cultural representations of lesbian desire in contemporary Mexico and how narratives can serve to challenge normative concepts of issues such as gender identity, race, and class. Alejandra Marquez, all of this is so rich, and I want to talk about it for like days.
Thank you.
I wanted to add the other thing that was really great about your intro, and the reason why I want to talk about it on the show is your intro says Ale has a broad spectrum of research interests that include queer/queer theory, feminism and gender violence in Latin America, Mexican Chronicle or Crónica, and gender and sexuality in Latin American film. What? Please come and talk to us all the time.
I would be happy to do that. Thank you.
So she has taught graduate and undergraduate courses at Michigan State University, including Latin America and its literature, women's Latin America, and queer Latin American literature of the 20th and 21st centuries. I forget we're in the 21st century. I'm like, oh, the future? But no, that's now. I'm old. Okay. Ali is also a self-proclaimed taco connoisseur and lover of all things related to Mexican food. And she says when she is not teaching or doing research, you can find her printmaking or working on illustrations.
Which, by the way, I had no idea you were that artistic. I'm loving all of the art that you're pushing out. So for context, Aubrey and our listeners, I thought it would be super interesting to add a little bit of like background. Ale and I grew up in the same town in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. And actually, when I talk about my coming out story, you are part of it. And I have a very distinct memory, and tell me if you remember this. I feel like I've had this conversation with you before, but we're in Bambi, which was our middle school, and we were wearing uniforms because in those days, that's what people did. And the girls in the class wanted to play Kiss the Boys. And I was like, ew, why would we do that? Why can't we just kiss the girls? And they like made fun of me and got really mad. So I went to go sit on this bench, and there was the new girl, Alejandra Marquez, sitting there. And I was like, you were like, do you want some of my sandwich? And I was like, no. I was like super mad that they didn't want to play Kiss the Girls.
Aw.
Oh my God.
What?
Sorry. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, that's my memory of meeting you. It's like I met you in this like playground of Bambi when I was pissed off about our gender norms of the playground.
And of course, while people would be discussing gender norms, I would be eating a sandwich by myself in the corner.
Sounds about right. For sure.
Well, I mean, I think if you add a book to the sandwich, I mean, that's just a whole day for me. I mean, food in a book, I don't see the problem with that. That was half of my lunches in middle school and high school. Sounds good to me.
Yeah. And then I totally forgot this like tidbit about you, but you did spend some time growing up in Texas in a little town called Gonzales, and also Laredo.
Yes.
I feel like you were in Laredo. No?
I was in Laredo for undergrad and for my master's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you grew up so you went to middle school together. You grew up in San Miguel de Allende together. And you also have a love for Mexican food and women, and also podcasts. Can you tell us about what's this podcast?
Oh yeah, so I collaborate in a podcast called Hablemos, Escritorias. So like, let's talk about women writers, basically. And it's a project that is led by Adriana Pacheco, who works for the University of Texas at Austin. And I somehow stumbled into it, and I loved it so much because it's just focused on women writers or women identified writers. And initially it was, I think it was just Mexico and then just Latin America, and now it's growing and growing and growing. And so I realized that Adriana and I had a bunch of people in common. And so I sent her a Facebook message and I was like, oh my God, I love your podcast. I'm such a fan. And she was like, awesome, do you want to, maybe have a conversation about some authors that you like? I was like, what? Like, really? And so I was super excited. I did that, and then I was super nervous. Like, if you listen to my first contribution, I sounded like I was going to pass out, and I felt like I was going to pass out. And then after that, she was like, you should come back. And I was like, really? And she was like, yeah, just talk about writers that you like or books that you like, and and do some book reviews. So I collaborate with them. I haven't done much this past year just because of the pandemic. But I'm reviewing a book soon. Maybe it'll probably be out in like a month or two. So it's a really cool project. Right now they've opened a shop. So it's like you can get books by women writers from Latin America that you normally would not be able to get in the US. So I think they're doing some really, really cool stuff to make sure that these writers are being read and being taught. So it's an amazing project.
I love it. We will totally like cross promote and add links in our description for our listeners to learn more about this. It is mostly or solely in Spanish.
It's in Spanish, although I think there have been a couple of episodes in English.
Cool. Awesome. So for our listeners que hablan español, por favor, hay que escuchar Hablemos Escritoras because it's good. So I want to start out before we deep dive too much into some of your work. Ale, I'd love to have you tell us your coming out story.
I love telling this story. I've told this story a million times because when I was a graduate student at UNC, I helped them with Safe Zone training. I don't know if it's called Safe Zone anymore. It's, just a training that they would hold for the community to learn more about LGBTQ individuals. And so part of it was a panel with people that were out, and we would tell our coming out story. So I've told this a million times, and I think it's a really fun story. So I was usually like the comic relief because my story is really funny. And so I identify as a lesbian, I guess. That's probably the closest thing. Queer, I have never openly identified as queer, but more like a lesbian, and it's a bit of a political thing that we can get into later. But I always knew that I like girls, but I didn't, and you grew up in San Miguel, so you know that San Miguel, 15 years ago was not like a queer mecca at all. There were probably a lot of gay men. No, not at all. I think, I always say that I'm the only lesbian in town, and I technically don't even live here. There are more, of course, but it's not very visible. And so it wasn't visible then. And so growing up, I was very scared. And so I made this choice, actually once I left for college, that's when I was like, oh, okay, I think I am, lesbian. And so I decided that I was going to keep it on the DL and like not tell my mom until, when I think back on it, I'm like, oh, that was like a very, good idea, which was, I'm not going to tell her until I've graduated and I'm financially stable. So she can't kick me out of the house, because I thought she was not going to take it well at all. Not because she was like a raging homophobe. I just didn't know. It was really hard to tell with my mom. And so I was in college, and I was in Mexico for a year in college. And I had a girlfriend in Mexico City. I was living in Puebla, which is a couple hours drive from Mexico City. And so I came home for the holidays, and my stepdad went to sleep really early, and it was just my mom and I. So we were having a little bit to drink. And she was, I'm going to say, more than tipsy. And she was like, well, you should tell me something about yourself that I don't know. And I was like, you know everything about me. She was like, no, there's things that I don't know. And I was like, what could you possibly be talking about? I don't know. And so we just sort of did that thing back and forth for like 30 minutes because I didn't want to say it. So I was like, well, if you know something, what is it? And she was like, no, you have to say it. And I was like, I'm not going to say it. So it was like that forever.
Wait, did you think that she knew, or that she already had a hint of it, or did she?
I was like, at that point,
really
I was like, at that point, I was like, she knows, and she's trying to get me to say it, but I'm not going to say it. Like, if she knows, she's going to tell me. And I think that was sort of like how she felt. Like, I know, and now she knows that I know, so she's gonna say it. So it was just like this never-ending thing. And finally, she was like, "You're a lesbian and you're dating, whoever I was dating at the time." And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "You're not mad or weirded out?" And she was like, "No, like I've known this for a while and I've been, thinking about it for a while." And of course I was like, "Well, how did you know?" And of course she gave me the most mom response, like, "I'm your mother, of course I know, right?" And so it was really nice because I was like immediately like, oh God, like how is this gonna change our relationship? Because I mean, we were close, but not as close as we are now. And I always say that the reason we became really, really close was like after I came out, or I always say I didn't come out, she dragged me out. So she dragged me out of the closet. It just sort of felt like I can just be myself all the time now. And it was, it took her a while because I also was afraid that it was going to be this thing where she knew, but we just didn't talk about it. And it was going to make me feel not great. And I didn't want to feel any shame because honestly, like I can say that I'm fortunate and privileged enough that I've never felt shame about my sexuality. And so I didn't want that to be the case. And so it took her a bit. And then it became this thing where like I would go out for lunch with a friend. She'd be like, "Is that your girlfriend? Are you dating?" And I'd be like, "No, not at all." She'd be like, "You can tell me." And I'd be like, "No, I'm just having lunch with a friend." And now, like she's met my girlfriends and she's been super sweet and loving and accepting, and she's very picky with who I date. And it's great. So
So Aubrey, I have to share, I have the fondest memories of actually going to Ale's house. Her mom always made us like food that I was never allowed to have at my house. And I have very fond memories of your NSYNC posters.
oh my God.
NSYNC
They're in my closet right now.
Backstreet Boys.
I haven't thrown them out. NSYNC, come on.
Stop it.
I have one of those NSYNC puppet dolls from the
Oh, really?
was it Bye 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 video? Yeah, I have one, and I'm never getting rid of it.
Oh no, but like Aubrey, Holly was obsessed. She knew all the lyrics. I loved going over to her house. Her mom was always there, really attentive. She would always make us like awesome junk food and like quesadillas, and like I just have like the best memories of your mom. And I haven't seen her in so long, but everything you're saying, I'm like, oh my God, I can picture it right now. It's so great. That is an awesome coming out story. And how about your like extended family? How did they react, or your friends?
Well, I mean, extended family, and I'm just saying this because I know they're not going to listen to this podcast. And even if they did, that would be okay. But like my mom didn't. I mean, my father has never been in my life, so it doesn't count. But then my mom has sisters, and they didn't speak for a very long time. Like for, I don't know, I want to say maybe like 15 years they didn't speak at all. And then out of the blue, they started talking again. And my mom was sort of like, "This is your family, you should love them." And I was like, "I don't know these people. I have nothing in common with these people at all." And so we had like a family reunion and in Ciudad Juarez, because my family is all from northern Mexico. So also like I'm the black sheep of the family because I was born in Mexico City. And Aubrey, I don't know if you know this, and I don't know if like your audience knows this, probably not. But people outside of Mexico City, most people outside of Mexico City don't love people from Mexico City. And people in northern Mexico especially don't like people from Mexico City. So I'm the black sheep of the family because I was born in Mexico City. I don't know if I sound like I'm from Mexico City anymore, but I sound like I'm definitely not from northern Mexico. So it was really weird, sort of meeting my family. They're all very much the same, very like heteronormative, very, I don't know. They just,
well, what's the problem?
They're
with
very
people from
much
Mexico City. Like,
There's a lot to unpack.
no, I mean,
that is why I'm asking
you
so that we can unpack it, because that's what I think I'm trying to do with this episode, is that I know very little about contemporary Mexican culture. I've learned about
Right.
Mexican history, from a political standpoint, but I know nothing about current contemporary culture. So,
It's a lot like the relationship that maybe a Texan might have to a New Yorker. Like
okay.
Texas would be Mexico City, and then New Yorkers, their sentiments of like other people, or maybe even New Jersey and New York, like those
Okay, all
different
right.
names.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah,
it's like that kind of
that does make sense. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, and Mexico City is notoriously, they're a richer city. They're, I think, the second biggest city in the world, or they were for a very long time. I don't know where they stand now. So people from Mexico City travel a lot around Mexico, and they just have a bad rep of like being the dirty tourist, the loud tourist, the annoying ones. They spend money, they like things fast, cheap, and quick. But on the flip side, Mexico City has a lot of education, incredible museums, tons of rich history. So it's such an interesting dynamic, but it's really like the North versus the South kind of dynamic that I think you were referring to, Ale, but interject where you must.
No, yeah, I
Yeah,
agree with
yeah.
that, but also it's like in the US you have North and South, but here it's like everybody against Mexico City. But it's like people from Mexico City don't care, right? But at the same time, if you think about it, Mexico is a very centralized country, right? So like
They don't care.
education, culture, it's all invested in Mexico City, and it's like the center for everything. So I think that leaves, so especially like even with literature, like for a very long time, if you weren't writing from Mexico City, nobody was going to read
You
your
don't
work,
matter.
and
Yeah.
that's changed. Yeah. So I think there's like this privilege of being in Mexico City and getting to experience more things, having more access to certain things that than if you're on the outside. And then also like in northern Mexico, people are, I would say, like Texans, like very much like macho, like cowboys, this sort of personality. Whereas in Mexico City, typically a lot of the times they think of like, oh, like the urban, more not as macho. And of course there's also like a racial component, right? Like in the north, a lot of people tend to be whiter, not everyone, right? But that's sort of how it is. And like a lot of the comments that I've heard from northern Mexico towards people in central Mexico, Mexico City, and then the rest of the country is like, well, they're more indigenous. So there's a lot of interesting and problematic dynamics going on with that.
Yeah, and the color of your skin and how light your eye or your hair is a huge thing in Mexican culture, and we could have a whole episode just
Mm-hmm.
dedicated to that.
Yeah,
But
Oh
it's one of
yeah.
those
Oh
where
yeah.
African American culture and Mexican culture kind of that line up where the historic preference is to be lighter skinned is what you would want to be. And I remember dating myself, but there was an issue a few years back about how Mexican Vogue had never put an indigenous uh, looking person on their cover, and Mexican Vogue always went towards more lighter skin models. And I don't remember, I think that was a few years back. I've slept
yeah,
since then or
it was
haven't slept since then, but that was a big thing. It's like,
a huge deal.
yeah.
And it's such a rich topic. And like I said, that could be like a whole other podcast. But Ale, I really want to hear about, I noticed that on your website you had two different spellings of queer. So you had queer as in Queer, and then right next to it, it was like /queer. And I'm saying it in this weird, like Hispanic accent because I feel like that's what I want to do, but it's
Yeah.
Cuir. Talk to me
Mhm.
about this word.
So this is a word that was, established, or that the people that came up with this are academics and activists working either from Latin America or in other places like the US or Europe, but specifically on issues of queerness in Latin America. And so it comes from an effort of trying to translate queer, because like if we translate queer into Spanish, I mean, the closest thing would be raro, rarito, there have been several attempts to translate it, but queer in English has like a cultural significance, and the way in which queer communities have reappropriated the term, it's like a political move in its own. So because translating queer into Spanish doesn't have the same historical background or the same historical significance, there have been other ways to try to translate it. So queer, Cuir, is one of those ways in which it has been done. So that's what I use a lot of the times when I'm writing. Either I do queer in italics or queer, because it's just sort of a way to say, okay, we're going to think about we're obviously going to use queer theory, but we're going to think about queerness from within Latin America, instead of just sort of bringing these historically white frameworks and try to apply them to Latin America. So it's sort of like it's an ongoing process of rethinking and translating and reappropriating it from Latin America.
I love that. And honestly, like when I think about reading the word queer in my like Mexican self, I'm like, how would those words do not make sense in Spanish in any shape, way, or form.
No, and like even, in like day-to-day society, I was talking to a friend who very well and whom I love very much, and it's one of my best friends, and I'm not gonna name her on the show, but she's straight and she's from Mexico, and I said something to her about some workshop that I took on queer literature, and she was like, ¿Qué es eso? Like, what is that? And I was like, queer, and she was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you explain it? So I explained it. She was like, I had no idea that this was a thing, and she's, she's not uneducated. I think she's like your, standard Mexican, educated Mexican. And so I was like, wow, it's not like in the US where like, if you say, oh, so-and-so is queer or whatever, like most people will understand because of that historical significance of the word queer that you don't have here.
Well, yeah, and I think even when you read a lot of queer Latina writers, a lot of times those stories, like I read Juliet Takes a Breath, and that came out about 5 years ago. That is more from a Puerto Rican perspective, and it was based in America. And so a lot of the readings that I have in terms of lesbian fiction is still some form of a Latin American representation or identity, but in the United States, not centered in Latin America or in Mexico, which is why India was so insistent that we had this conversation in the show, because we seem to be stopping the conversation at the border arbitrarily, instead of having a complete understanding of what's going on really in our continent, in Latin America, and the connections between the two. So I find that very interesting.
Well, and to be perfectly frank, I had no idea that there was queer Latin American literature until Ale and I reconnected on Facebook. And I was like, 1, holy shit, I can't believe we're still connecting on Facebook. 2, we're both gay, fuck yeah. 3, what? Let's talk about this. So I'd love to hear—
in that order.
Yes, in exactly that order. I'd love to hear, tell us about your favorite queer Latin American literature, or specific, either a writer or a specific genre or section. Tell us more.
Or maybe some titles for those of us that really aren't that familiar with the literature, that maybe some intro titles so that we can go to the library and start reading them. Or
yeah, so the thing is, a lot of them are not translated into English. I believe maybe some of the most well-known books might be. I'm not sure. Like if you think about lesbian literature in Mexico specifically, like the first, and I say lesbian literature, but I don't necessarily believe that that's a genre. I think it's, for me, it's like literature that in some way represents lesbian desire or a same-sex or a queer desire, right? But it's called Amora by Rosa Maria Rofiel, and that was published in 1989. So like, you think about it, it's very recent, like I was born before that, came out. So it's very recent. And I think so, like, that's the main, the most well-known. And then after that, you have Sara Levi Calderon, which is actually a pseudonym because the author came from a very wealthy Jewish family in Mexico City. So she had to write under a pseudonym because her family was basically harassing her and threatening her for being a lesbian and for speaking about it publicly. So that was published in 1990. And so I think some of the scholars say that it was actually written before Amora, but published after. So there's like that ongoing thing. So I think those are like the main titles, but there's all these different writers that I think are wonderful and worth reading. And of course, my work and my current project is very based in, Mexico. But a novel that I really, really like, that I read somewhat recently, is by a trans author, or I should say travesti, which is a different category, out of Argentina. And it's sort of a reappropriation of the word, travesti, which in a literal translation to English would be transvestite, but it doesn't mean the same thing, right? It's not, and I know that word is out of use now in the US and in other places, but in Spanish, in Latin American Spanish, it's been reappropriated as a way to reject the idea of transgender as something that has been theorized in the global north. So travesti is typically a feminine presenting person, but a lot of travestis, they don't necessarily believe that they're in a binary. So they'll use feminine pronouns, they'll present as feminine. They were assigned male at birth, but they're trying to sort of go against the idea of gender through a different, conception of their own identity. It's fascinating, and you can read about it. There's I think some works by travesti activists have been translated. So there's a novel by travesti writer Camila Sosa Villada, who just won the Premio Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, which is a very important award given to women writers. So it's the first time that a trans, or in this case travesti, writer wins that award. And it's called Las Malas. And it's basically like, it's autobiographic fiction, and it's fascinating. It's so well written. It's a beautiful, beautiful story with, a lot of really dark things, but I think it's more than just portraying the violence that travestis have to go through, because a lot of times, of course, they have to work in prostitution because there's no work for them. And this is mostly in Argentina, in Peru, in Chile, but actually Argentina just passed a travesti and trans labor law in which they are going to hopefully be getting more jobs. I think, I don't want to generalize, but I want to say it's probably the first of its kind in Latin America. So it's a huge and amazing step towards, inclusivity of trans and travesti individuals. So Las Malas by Camila Sosa Villada, wonderful. There's just so many books that I like. There's also it's like an illustrated book. I don't necessarily call it like a graphic novel, but it's like an illustrated book by writer Artemisa Telles, who is in Mexico. And it's called Crema de Vainilla, and it sort of deals with like BDSM. There's all kinds of really cool things that are being written in Latin America. And like I think, like India said, it's a lot of times you don't think like, oh, queer literature, Latin America, but there are a lot of really great and innovative writers.
I think that's part of the problem is that, and this is me coming from someone who's lived in the United States for like 35 out of my almost 40 years, we don't think about Latin America in the United States. We don't think about Mexico. We don't think about our obsession with the word, calling ourselves American as a country, and negating the fact that that talks about two continents and Latin America and like a billion other people. And so we don't tend to have those conversations in the United States. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to have you on the show, Ale. I mean, it's hard for me to explain myself because of where I'm from and my intersectionality and the different borders that I grew up in. And I know that you share a lot of that same experience. And I know that most of our listeners are based in the US, but not all of them.
Not all of them.
And
We have an interesting following of people in Australia.
Mhm.
Quite a few people in Australia listen
Ooh.
to our show.
Yeah, which
That's
is
awesome.
But I'd love to hear what you think of queer Latin American culture today. Like, where do you think it is today? And how do you think it's going? All right, folks, that was it for this episode. But we will see you for part 2. Stay tuned. Let us know what you think. Please send an email or message us on Instagram. We really enjoyed this conversation with Ale Marquez, and we have a whole other episode where we deep dive to answer this question.
You can find more information about this episode and the show at our website, southernqueeries.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram by searching Southern Queeries. Queeries is with 2 E's. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Some credits. Production, your hosts, India and Aubrey. Audio mixing by Allison Hawley. Story research, Aubrey Calvin. Editing, India Bastian. This is Southern Queeries.